Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 3 of our series on white fragility. In today's video, we're going to be looking at chapters 5 through 8. And as a reminder, we have a scripture that is our basis for this series. And it's the famous passage where Jesus instructs the audience to remove the plank from their own eye before they're able to remove the speck from somebody else's. And Doug is going to get us started today with a story from the author Robin DiAngelo about how she put that into practice.
What I liked what she did was she talked very openly and candidly about her own prejudices that she's working on. She revealed that she has Black friends and that she works with Black people all the time. But that when she meets a stranger on the street, that some feelings immediately arise within her. So I appreciate that honesty and candor. She says that these anti-Black feelings are acquired by the media, some cases our upbringing, by jokes that white people tell amongst themselves. And what was actually encouraging is that she understands the need that she has these feelings, and she understands that these deeper feelings need to be examined more. And she reminds us that we live in a culture that circulates constant messages of white superiority while simultaneously sending those same messages of Black inferiority. And that we all sort of we receive these messages and we internalize them. And then hopefully have the insight to examine, are these valid, the things that I'm taking in?
Thank you, Doug, for sharing that with us. Now, as we transition into the reading in chapters 5 through 8, there's two key concepts we're going to be focusing on. First is the good-bad binary of racism. And second, we're going to define the namesake of the book and what actually is white fragility. To get us started now, here's a quote from chapter 5. This appears on page 73, and this really helps define it. If, as a white person, I conceptualize racism as a binary, and I place myself on the not racist side, what further action is required of me? No action is required because I am not a racist. Therefore, racism is not my problem. It doesn't concern me, and there is nothing further I need to do. Now let's hear Doug's thoughts on that chapter 5.
But what I want to highlight for now in chapter 5 is that prior to the Civil Rights Movement, DiAngelo puts it out there and says that it was acceptable for white people to openly proclaim their beliefs of their racial superiority. And then she also brought the Northern whites into the mix as well, saying that they were actually appalled by the images of the violence that was happening in the South. That racism became to be thought of as isolated events, and that it happened with bad people. So you had that binary that was created there. The bad people were, in that time, the Southern people who were, mistreating Black folks, and that the good people, or morally good people, were the Northern whites who assisted in helping to get civil rights. DiAngelo goes on to say that this viewpoint makes it almost impossible for white people to talk about racism. It puts white people either in a category of good people or bad people, and that if you talk about racism, you don't want to be. Who wants to be considered a bad person or morally corrupt? And she suggests that instead of focusing on individual acts of racism, that racism is more about the interpersonal as well as the cultural, historical, and structural, or we call systemic racism. And that in order to do that, in order to address those issues, that white people need to stop looking at racism as either good or bad, or good, only bad people does those things. and instead focus your attention on the systemic problems of them.
So we can see once again how those definitions from week 1 and 2 have really come back into play. How we define racism matters and how we react and respond to it. So now as we look at chapter 6, titled AntiBlackness, and there's a quote from page 91 that really sums it up well. It says, "Creating a separate and inferior black race simultaneously created the superior white race. One concept could not exist without the other. In this sense, whites need black people. Blackness is essential to the creation of white identity." And now to Doug to open that up further for us.
The construction of white identity and white superiority was in fact dependent upon the simultaneous creation of an idea of blackness. And I'm like, blackness? Wasn't it always there? I mean, it's the color. He actually emphasizes that while all people of color experience some degree of racism in general, that there are differences based upon the group's specific history, the role that the dominant group assigns to them, as well as the position that the dominant groups put those people of color in. And she talks about how racism can even vary within groups. She talks about Asian Americans and says that Chinese American may experience racism differently than a Japanese American, or a Hispanic person may experience racism different. And my final point, she proposes that anti-Blackness is actually fundamental to white people's very identity as white people. That whiteness has always been based on Blackness. Wow, where did she get that from? Well, she takes us back to chapter 2 and reminds us that there was no concept of a white race before the need to justify enslavement of Africans. That by creating an inferior black race, at the same time, you create a superior white race, and that one cannot exist without the other. And when you think about it, they are sort of mutually dependent upon each other, if you look at it from that framework. And then I think what's important is that when she says that when she speaks of white people, she's not talking about individual white people. She's talking about white people as a collective group. So those are some of the things that I sort of highlighted out of chapter 5 and chapter 6. And I look forward to discussing them more with each of you.
Thank you again, Doug, for sharing those insights with us. Now, as we transition into chapters 7 and 8, Pastor Jane is going to look at these two chapters together. And it's really going to help paint a picture of what white fragility is. So chapter 7 is entitled Racial Triggers for White People. And we'll see a visual aid that's listing some of those. And chapter 8 is titled The Result, White Fragility. And here's a quote I'd like to share from chapter 8 on page 113. "In my workshops, I often ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our own unaware yet inevitable racism? How often has that gone well for you? Eye-rolling, head-shaking, and outright laughter follow, along with the consensus of rarely, if ever. I then ask, what would it be like if you could simply give us feedback, have us graciously receive it, reflect, and work to change the behavior? Recently, a man of color sighed and said, it would be revolutionary." And now to Pastor Jane for that summary of chapters 7 and 8.
This is the world that we swim in. This is kind of a good breakdown of this white world that white people live in that they have never been challenged about. She wasn't challenged about this till she was in her 30s. That there's social taboos about talking openly about race. So that's one of the reasons why nothing changes, because it's not good to talk about. That there's this good, bad, racist binary. That there's fear and resentment towards people of color, and people don't or it's a taboo to talk about that. We have a delusion that we're objective, that we see everybody the same, and that's a delusion. That there's guilty knowledge that there's more going on than we would like to admit. And I'm sure that all of us would admit that we know that there's problems and we have been loath to address them. There's deep investment in a system that we're taught is fair, but benefits white people. There's internalized superiority and a feeling of a right to rule. And there's a deep cultural legacy of anti-Black sentiments. So this is just the world that we live in. And then she points out what are some of the things that happen that are triggers that that cause us then to feel fragile about our whiteness. So they're suggesting a white person's viewpoint comes from a radicalized point of view. There's people of color talking directly about their own racial perspective. There's people of color choosing not to protect white people's feelings about race. People of color being unwilling to tell their stories or answer questions of race. A fellow white challenging our racial beliefs. Receiving feedback that our behavior had a racist impact. Suggesting that group membership is significant. Acknowledging access is unequal. Other racial groups being presented outside of the stereotypes placed on them. And saying that white people do not represent or speak for all of humanity. When white people hear these kinds of things, those are the triggers, she suggests, that get people to start acting like Karens and being unreasonable in their inability to listen to Black people talk about their experiences, and to get white people start pulling out the logs out of their eyes. On page 108, where the author says, the large body of research about children and race demonstrates that children start to construct their ideas about race very early. And I think a lot of white people think, well, I didn't, like, only the bad people are carefully taught by their parents to be racist. And I just wanted to lift up that children understand the difference of race. They don't need to be, they understand things. And because there's just this kind of this code that we don't talk about it, except that we exhibit it in our lives, starts teaching children very early and not very carefully about racism, and that to be white is good and to be Black is bad and is lesser.
Thank you again, Pastor Jane and Doug, and thank you to everybody out there who's following along, reading the book along, and watching these videos. So we'll see you again next week as we look at the final 4 chapters, chapters 9 through 12. And again for this week, we hope that you remember those 2 key concepts of the good-bad binary and how that prevents us from addressing issues like racism. And also the concept of white fragility itself, and how that can make us defensive and unwilling to open our ears to hear other people and other stories. So thank you once again, and look forward to being in communication with you throughout the week as we chat in the comments about these 2 chapters, and I look forward to hearing your reflections and your responses to them as well. Have a great week and stay safe, everyone.